So, jumping right in, this material is a highly passionate commentary piece dissecting how various political commentators have reacted to and allegedly manipulated the narrative surrounding the tragic death of Charlie Kirk.
Yeah, it definitely has a ton of undeniable energy to it.
It does, right? And, there's a very clear, potent core thesis here about narrative manipulation and grifting. But it requires significant refinement to maximize its authoritative impact.
Absolutely.
So, getting right into our first point, the abrupt pivots between grave accusations and unrelated commercial endorsements severely undercut the material's intended emotional gravity.
Yeah, that structural dissonance is really where the architecture of the entire argument just starts to fracture.
Right.
Because, when we look at the emotional demands this piece places on the listener, the stakes are positioned as incredibly high. The writer is dealing with literal life and death, the visceral realities of violence, and the psychological torment of a grieving family.
Yeah, heavy stuff.
Extremely heavy. Yet the framing doesn't support that immense weight at all. It fundamentally cheapens the argument, and it does so on a deeply psychological level. When a speaker asks their audience to feel righteous, burning moral indignation about a murdered public figure, they're asking the audience to enter a very vulnerable, serious emotional state,
Exactly. And let's look at how that actually plays out in the text itself. The material moves seamlessly from describing the horrific violence of a murder,
Right.
like complete with visceral, graphic details of a victim gushing blood, and diagnosing a rival commentator as an absolute sociopath, directly into a jovial promotional read for Backyard Butcher.
It's just so jarring.
It really is. The script literally goes from calling someone a psychopath to shouting about American meat and yes, Queen for like a 30% discount on ribeyes.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It feels like playing a slide whistle in the middle of a eulogy. When you ask for righteous indignation, you demand vulnerability from the listener. If you pivot to selling ribs in the very next breath, you essentially tell the audience they were foolish for caring so deeply just a second ago. How does that impact the listener's trust?
Well, breaking that tension to celebrate a meat discount tells the audience that the narrator's outrage isn't really an all-consuming moral conviction. It makes the indignation feel performed rather than genuine.
Right, like they're just putting on a show.
Exactly. The grave tragedy is, on some level, just serving as a vehicle for a transaction. It creates this massive sense of cognitive dissonance. You cannot be the moral arbiter of a national tragedy while simultaneously acting as a pitchman, at least not without giving the listeners some kind of psychological buffer.
Because the audience just instinctively recoils, right? The parasocial trust has been breached.
For sure.
Taking that a step further, if you put the ad in the middle of this specific type of high-stakes narrative, you're essentially telling the audience that your outrage is on a timer. So, looking at script, we need to build a firewall between the tragedy and the commerce.
Definitely.
If I were editing this, my immediate thought would be to shove the ad read to a designated, pre-planned break at the very beginning or the very end of the segment.
Yeah, I'd say bookending the content with the sponsorships is the most elegant solution here. By placing the commercial obligations at the outer edges of the audio, you leave the emotional core of the piece completely uninterrupted.
Makes sense.
The listener can fully immerse themselves in the gravity of the analysis without anticipating this really jarring interruption.
But let's play devil's advocate for a second, because the financial realities of producing content often dictate the format.
Sure.
What if the contract with Backyard Butchers explicitly requires a mid-roll ad placement? We still have to pay the bills, right?
Right, of course.
If it has to stay in the middle, I'd argue we need auditory and tonal buffers. We could use a somber, neutral musical bumper, followed by a deliberate 10-second pause before beginning the ad read.
Oh, I love that. A pause like that is incredibly effective. Silence in audio is just a very powerful tool. It acts as a palate cleanser.
Yeah.
It allows the heavy emotional residue of the previous segment to sort of settle before the commercial reality intrudes. Alternatively, you must insert a clear, tonal transitional phrase that acknowledges the shift in reality.
So what does that look like on the page? I imagine it needs to be something that breaks the fourth wall just enough to show respect for the listener's emotional momentum.
Yeah, definitely.
Something like, we are going to take a brief, necessary pause here to keep the lights on, and when we come back, we'll continue unpacking the severe fallout of these rumors.
That phrasing works perfectly. It signals to the audience that you respect the gravity of the topic enough to formally step away from it before trying to sell them something.
Right.
It preserves the trust, and preserving that trust is paramount, because losing it undermines the entire journalistic endeavor.
which transitions us right into the next issue. Because just as that misplaced ad placement disrupts the gravity of the piece, the language used to attack the opponent also detracts from the serious core message. Relying heavily on highly charged theatrical insults distracts from the core substantive claims being made about the dissemination of false narratives.
It really does. It touches on this vital difference between striking a performative blow and actually winning the argument.
Yeah, well said.
When we evaluate the sheer amount of real estate dedicated to name-calling here, it becomes a structural liability.
To put it in perspective for a second, the material spends a vast amount of its runtime calling the target a lemon-eating face, a psychopath, an effing narcissist, a theater kid, and even teasing the use of the C word.
It's just a lot.
It is. This takes up far more oxygen than strictly dismantling her geopolitical arguments. Now, I have to push back here for a moment.
Okay.
Is it possible the writer is simply giving their loyal audience the aggressive red meat they expect? Like, if they strip away the theatrical insults, don't they risk making the piece feel less engaging to a base that tunes in specifically for this kind of fiery, combative conflict?
Look, I understand the instinct to play to the base, and there is undeniably a primal entertainment value in a vicious takedown. Audiences within specific political media ecosystems often crave that performative friction.
Oh, totally.
However, this specific approach fundamentally dilutes the much stronger factual critique buried underneath the name-calling. The speakers actually have a highly compelling point about the target promulgating uncorroborated rumors originally sourced from Max Blumenthal.
Yeah, it's a great point.
And they also have an incredibly sharp, devastating critique about the target manipulating a widow's maiden name by chanting, "Long live Erica France."
Right. So the foundation of the argument is rock solid. It's the execution that's muddying the waters. If you bury this valid, empirical criticism under a mountain of juvenile insults, you end up sounding petty and reactionary rather than authoritative.
Furthermore, it gives the opponent an incredibly easy excuse to dismiss the entire critique as mere bullying.
Oh, that's a huge trap.
Exactly. Think about the mechanics of a public debate. If you call someone a lemon-eating face, they don't have to defend their uncorroborated claims about $200 million Israeli bribes.
Nope.
They can just point at the insult and say, "Look at these unhinged, hateful people attacking me." You are handing the opponent the very shield they need to deflect the actual evidence. You give them an unearned escape hatch.
You're letting them off the hook by focusing on their face rather than their facts.
Precisely.
So to elevate the critique, the writer needs to focus strictly on the mechanics of the grift and the factual inconsistencies. We need to allow the subject's own verifiable actions to organically demonstrate their poor character to the audience.
Show, don't tell.
Exactly. It's the ultimate form of show, don't tell in an audio format. If I'm restructuring this script, instead of repeatedly asserting that the target is a classic sociopath, I would just isolate and dissect the specific video clip of her saying, "Long live Erica France."
Yes, breaking down that specific moment step by step is exactly how you project authority. You walk the audience through the cold mechanics of what she is doing.
Right.
Explain how weaponizing a grieving widow's maiden name merely to drive social media engagement metrics objectively demonstrates a profound lack of basic human decency. When you present the raw, unfiltered behavior without the crutch of a label, the audience will conclude she is a sociopath entirely on their own.
Which is so much more powerful.
It is. The realization belongs to them, which makes it far more profound and persuasive.
And suddenly, the narrator shifts from sounding like an angry rival holding a grudge to sounding like an objective, investigative authority.
Exactly.
Another way to frame this on the page is to build the critique entirely around the absence of evidence. Take the massive claim about Netanyahu offering Charlie Kirk $200 million. Instead of calling the commentator a grifter or a liar, the writer should patiently lay out the timeline.
Laying out the timeline is a highly effective mechanism. You show that this extraordinary claim was never corroborated by any secondary source, yet it was deliberately packaged and sold to an audience for profit.
Right, you just lay the facts bare.
Yeah, you let the sheer absurdity of the facts hang in the air. When you present undeniable evidence with calm, surgical precision, your authority skyrockets, and the insult becomes entirely obsolete.
It's the difference between throwing a wild, flailing punch in a bar fight and executing a highly precise martial art. The latter requires discipline, but it is far more devastating.
About the facts or the people involved in the timeline, the entire argument collapses under its own weight.
Which perfectly tees up our final major point for this critique. If the writer is going to strip away these insults to focus more intently on the concrete evidence and the specific players involved in this grift, they absolutely must ensure the audience actually understands who all these players are.
Yes.
The narrative assumes a level of granular familiarity with various political factions and secondary characters that risks alienating anyone outside of a hyper-specific niche.
This is a classic trap for subject matter experts, particularly in the realm of political or media commentary.
We see it all the time.
Constantly. When you live and breathe a topic, parsing through niche internet subcultures every single day, you develop a massive blind spot. You forget what it's like to encounter this dense web of information for the very first time.
Yeah, looking at the transcript, it fires off names and factions in rapid succession, without allowing the listener any breathing room whatsoever. In the span of just a few sentences, we got Zoran Medani, Blake Neff, Graham Allen, Tyler Robinson, alongside references to left-wing Discord servers, the SPLC, and the Gray Zone.
It's a lot to process.
It genuinely feels like walking into Season 5 of a highly complex political drama without having seen the recap. You are immediately lost in a sea of proper nouns. But how does a writer balance keeping a brisk, engaging pace for their loyal fans who already know this lore without completely losing the casual listeners who might be tuning in for the first time?
The central issue here is a psychological concept known as cognitive load, cluttering the narrative with undefined secondary characters and dense internet lore entirely obscures the central conflict.
Right.
When the human brain encounters a new proper noun without context, it momentarily stalls. The audience has to expend constant mental energy trying to remember who Blake Neff is or trying to recall the specific ideological leanings of the Gray Zone.
Yeah, their brain is just working overtime on the wrong things.
Exactly. While their working memory is hijacked by processing that background information, they completely lose the thread of the main argument. And the main argument,
Which is the conflict over the false narrative surrounding the campus murder.
yes, that is what actually matters.
They're so busy trying to translate the vocabulary that they miss the actual story. It's like forcing the listener to do homework in real time. And the reality of audio consumption is that most listeners will simply opt out.
They really will.
They'll hit pause or change the show. To remedy this, the writer has to ruthlessly streamline the cast of characters by grouping them into clear, functional archetypes, or by providing immediate microscopic context clues right before invoking their specific names.
Streamlining is about deciding what functional role a character plays in your specific narrative. Let's examine the raw list of names. Blake Neff, Graham Allen, and Paramount Not So Tactical.
Right.
To a casual listener, that is just random, confusing noise. Instead of listing them individually and demanding the listener track 3 separate identities, refer to them collectively through their narrative function.
So if I'm editing that specific sentence, I would strike the names entirely and replace them with something like the Turning Point leadership who are desperately trying to protect the organization's legacy.
Exactly.
That tells the audience exactly why these people matter to the story in that exact moment, without bogging them down in individual biography. It categorizes them by their motive rather than their birth certificate.
Precisely. It anchors the listener to the action, not the trivia. Now, we must approach prominent figures differently. Take Max Blumenthal. He is central to the origin of these rumors, so you cannot simply erase his name or lump him into a broad archetype.
Right, he's too important to the thesis.
But you also shouldn't just rapid-fire his past employers like the Huffington Post or Slate without context, because that doesn't explain why he matters here.
Right. Telling me he worked at Slate 10 years ago doesn't help me understand why he is relevant to a story about Charlie Kirk today. Instead, the writer should add a tight, 5-second thematic identifier that serves the specific narrative. I would introduce him as Max Blumenthal, a commentator from the Gray Zone known specifically for muddying geopolitical waters.
Perfect. That tiny, deliberate addition gives the listener an immediate mental hook. They now know his exact function in your story. He is the architect of the confusion. That microcontext perfectly sets up your thesis about narrative manipulation before you even present the evidence.
And what about the names that are just entirely tangential to the core plot? There's always a temptation to include every single detail you uncovered during research just to prove you did the work.
Oh, that temptation is so real. But that leads to the third option, which is utilizing a cutting room floor. If a name like Zoran Medani isn't strictly essential to proving the core thesis about the killer's underlying motives, cut the name entirely. You don't need to name drop a local politician to establish a political vibe.
You can simply describe the killer's political affiliations broadly, like that he was active in radical socialist circles. By stripping away the unnecessary proper nouns, you keep the spotlight glaringly focused on the actions and the evidence that actually drive your argument forward.
Exactly. The listener doesn't need to know every branch of the tree to understand that the forest is on fire.
It ensures that the passion behind the piece is channeled effectively, rather than letting the sheer volume of information spill over and dilute the impact of the journalism. It really all comes back to managing focus. Whether we are analyzing the structural flow, the emotional tone, or the sprawling cast of characters, the overarching goal of an editor is to remove the obstacles standing between the audience and the core truth of the argument.
So true.
To quickly recap our critique today, first, manage your tonal shifts carefully. If you must pivot from a grave tragedy to a commercial sponsorship, build a clear structural or auditory firewall so you don't shatter the emotional trust of your audience.
Number 2, let your evidence do the heavy lifting.
Yes, replacing theatrical insults with surgical, factual deconstructions will project far more authority and deny your opponents an easy excuse to dismiss your claims. And finally, streamline your secondary characters using functional archetypes and microcontext to ensure your audience's mental energy is focused entirely on your central thesis, not on untangling niche internet lore.
Right on.
We highly encourage the author to apply these strategies to the manuscript and submit the revised work back to us for another critique. Returning to where we began today, if you want the jury to convict, you have to keep them entirely focused on the evidence. The moment you pull out the steak knives, you've already lost the case. Keep your argument sharp, keep it focused, and never break the tension.